And we are still waiting for the speakers, but maybe we should start anyways.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sarah, for making some time for Mr. Zattler to arrive before I'm speaking. Let's begin anyway. Maybe just as an advertising moment, I could also advertise for the other policy briefs, as you said, in the task force, because the task force, you have a very interesting policy briefs that focus a lot on the potential reforms to multilateral institutions in general, and one on WTO, which we might have some time to discuss today, but there is a variety that we could not synthesize in our issue paper. So let me just begin by trying to link what we do in this task force with what we've heard along the day this morning already. As we have heard this morning, one of the key elements that we start from in this task force is a crisis of distrust, a lack of trust between southern countries and the north, or as I heard this morning, the west, at least with the OECD countries and the G7 countries. It's particularly based on the fact that the crisis of COVID and the current crisis of due to the war and its impacts on prices is increasing the divide, and this divide on access to finance, on the capacity to finance recovery, is really extremely worrying. There is a recent OECD report on that, and what the southern colleagues with whom we have been speaking tell us is that behind this divide, there is the problem of a structural asymmetry in the international economic system, but also a structural asymmetry in agenda setting, in the way we look at the agendas, and I think we heard that this morning. And that was very explicit in the EU-AU summit, that still a lot of the African, Sub-Saharan Africa, the African Union countries were telling Europe that the agenda setting was too asymmetrical. So one of the key things that we want to insist in this task force is first that G7 countries have self-interest in changing, in contributing to reducing those asymmetries, in voicing and in financial capacity. A self-interest they have, but also that it's for the common good. And the second thing that we say in this, that we try to propose in this task force issue paper is how to do that. So a lot of the other papers, the policy briefs in the task force, are really converging with the ideas that we put the focus on, that is, the type of leadership by G7 needs to change. G7 can be a place for incubation. It can be a place for elaborating new types of alliances, like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships that Wolfgang Schmidt told us about this morning. But it should be inclusive, and it should not be leading by virtue, but leading by its capacity to innovate. And it should be inclusive in the way it sets agendas, and that's also one of the papers in the task force also insists a lot on linking what can be done in G7 with the initiatives already existing in G20. And one of the specific papers is also putting a lot of emphasis on how to organize a partnership between G7 and Africa in a structural manner. I know that the German presidency has invited the African Union president, but that should be more structural. So that's the basics about changing the leadership. But there is something that is extremely important also in terms of this asymmetry in financial capacities. Next year, 2023, will be a very important moment because a lot of the global South countries are insisting a lot in many of the relations with our G7 countries that the 2030 agenda is the legitimate framework for their development and for global sustainable development. It's a key framework. It should be a priority, both for northern and southern countries. But next year, when we do the midterm assessment of where we are in reaching the SDGs and where we are in mobilizing finance for the SDGs, it will be a particularly complicated moment. We heard a lot already on climate finance and other topics that it's not, we're talking about billions, but actually what is needed are trillions, and that's Secretary Yellen from the US has been recently putting a lot of emphasis on that. So we are not at scale. There are gaps to reach the objectives. And I think that's really, that's why one of the key elements that we try to put the emphasis on in this paper is that G7 countries, the G7 presidency by Germany and then by Japan, they need to prepare that moment. They need to increase public and private financial flows. And of course, infrastructures as presented in the G7 presidency's priorities, the emphasis of G7 on infrastructure will be important. I will come back to that. But it's really very important that G7 presidencies and G7 countries make a step change in the way they look at the role and responsibility as champions of global sustainable development to prepare for 2023, but leading with humility in the role, really looking also at the fact that G7 countries are not very advanced in the way that they have themselves domestically implemented Agenda 2030. The G7 countries also need to clarify their offer, but not in a perspective of competition with others, rather of collaboration. And they can and they should account for innovative experiences that they have, particularly in the way that they operate in third countries. So really that's the basic message, prepare for 2023, and we have 5 main messages in terms of implementation. First, account very transparently about the recent efforts about domestic implementation of SDGs in order to really show that it's not just an agenda that is imposed on southern countries, but that is an agenda where I think it was Korosi, or maybe the UNSG who was saying we're all developing countries when we look at Agenda 2030. The second point is to, of course, mobilize the power of financial institutions of G7 countries for SDGs as an agenda for growth, resilience, for industrialization, because what southern countries are looking for and what we hear them say is not just infrastructures, but behind that productive investments for jobs and value-added capture in those countries. So really an agenda of investment for the future. But my second point about mobilizing all the financial strength of G7 countries should not come in isolation. It's really about showing that it's contributing to coordinated efforts. And that's my third point. In the framework of multilateral development banks, it's very important that G7 countries coordinate among themselves and play their role of champions of alignment with the Agenda 2030 so that the MDBs can play that role better. My fourth point is that there are interesting examples, particularly from G7 countries' financial institutions, of alignment with Agenda 2030. That means alignment with country-specific strategies that lead to a specific transformation to reaching the SDGs. And these country-specific strategies are discussed and debated with civil society in a transparent manner. That's the type of alignment with SDGs that could be presented as something that matters, not necessarily talking directly about democratic values, the values of democracy, but talking about the instrumental value of having counter-expertise, civil society space for civil society to discuss those country-specific strategies for sustainability. And my fifth point is that we've seen in the development ministerial of G7 a lot of messages that are quite consistent with what we had in mind, but there is also this partnership for infrastructure and investment, PII, that I think is extremely important because it puts, but we insist on the fact that it needs to put infrastructure embedded in this global support for the Agenda 2030 and the second half of the period to 2030, supporting existing G20 principles on infrastructures, using the examples of the Just Energy Transition partnerships that have been mentioned this morning for the method that is behind that, the method that is about, with the example of South Africa, having South Africa have let South Africa have a policy debate and a political debate about the transition out of coal, and then come with financial means to support a strategy that is owned by South African stakeholders. So really exemplifying the method rather than just trying to replicate very rapidly all these just energy transition partnerships. So these are the messages from this task force. I hope this was not too long and that our colleagues were able to join in the meantime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sébastien. I'll just have a very quick look at Katrin, if Jürgen Zattler is there. I saw that he wrote an email that apparently he was in the speaker waiting room, but you'll figure it out. But then I will first of all turn to Imme Scholz. I mean, the very general question, like what's the role for the civil society in achieving the sustainable development goals, and maybe to pick up what Sébastien just said regarding the domestic implementation. I know that you're also part of the Council for Sustainable Development in Germany. Maybe you can also say a word on where do we stand with regard to domestic implementation of SDGs in Germany.
Yeah, thank you. It's a bit unusual for me to speak about civil society organizations because it's a recent change I have made, and before I was with DIE, and I'm very happy to see my colleagues, my former colleagues here, and to be at an event prepared by you together with the GSI. It's really great. I would say, if I start with the implementation of the SDGs in Germany, we are not on track for those systemic changes in the environmental use or in the connection between the exploitation of the natural environment or the burdening of the natural environment in relation to our prosperity. And globally, because I'm also the co-chair of the independent group of scientists who is preparing the next Global Sustainable Development Report to be published next year, the information clearly says that we weren't on track before the pandemic, and the pandemic obviously has worsened the situation, and we are, as we have heard this morning, expecting worsening trends also due to the war in Europe. But what is the role of civil society organizations for improving this picture? And usually you say civil society organizations have a big role in creating pressure from society, pressure on policymakers to act. That is the conventional view actually on civil society organizations, and it's the view they also have of themselves. For achieving practical change and making advocacy for specific issues. And I think what is important when looking at the paper you just summarized, Sébastien, is I share the analysis of the paper in the sense that you say the G7 has to lead by example, and at the same time it has to admit that it cannot lead anymore by sheer dominance, political or economic. So it has to accept or internalize the fact that it has it still has power, but it's reduced compared to 20 years ago. And it has to understand this loss of power and of dominance, not as a loss of advantage, but actually as a gain of partners. Because you want to, the SDGs, what they want is to achieve a global transformation, and you cannot do that with a small number of countries dominating the globe. This would completely overstretch the resources, and it would completely go against the democratic value these countries have experienced in their own territory. So, but this requires, so to say, a positive interpretation of the change in the last 20 years. And we see that this is very difficult for many G7 countries. Someone else mentioned this morning, that democracy is challenged not only externally, as Wolfgang Schmidt said, by Russia, for example, it's challenged internally. we have a sizable share of our populations in G7 countries who do not believe anymore in the effectiveness of democratic institutions, of political parties, and who want to be led by strong men or women. Yeah, we have both. That's the change. It's not only men, it's also women. So that is quite frustrating in a sense. And that gives, I think, adds another dimension to the role of civil society organizations to also engage in this process of interpretation of how to interpret, how to assess the changes of the last 20 years and what it means for a meaningful engagement of G7 countries in global affairs. And there we know that a classic tradition of development NGOs obviously is to say, pay more money. Yeah, where is the 0.7 goal for official development assistance in the public budgets? And from that perspective, you see the limits of such a campaign, because that is obviously not sufficient. It's input oriented, and in a way, it diminishes also what can be achieved by a more full international cooperation, which is based on real partnerships and not on partnerships between the one who gives and the other one who receives and then behaves accordingly. And for fulfilling that role, I think you have explained what it means for G7 governments, that they have to adjust to this new role and see the potential it has. But at the same time, so taking seriously the implementation of the SDGs domestically, but also being available as a reliable and generous, I would still say generous, international partner. And combining these two, we see how difficult it is for our countries to really achieve that. Not only in financial terms, but in thinking terms, in the terms of how policies are defined. Now, for CSOs to play an important role in that context, I think it is important. It is good that we have so many NGOs and CSOs who are explicitly engaged at global level, so at UN level, or at international level. There are different platforms where to be present. But it is important that the CSOs do not lose their anchor in local realities as well, so that CSOs do not only, so that they are able to follow through what they decry, what they want to have changed, and connected to what is happening on the ground. Because what is happening on the ground is often has to be unearthed. And that is an important function of CSOs, and that's why they get on government's nerves. And I think that is where there is a similarity between think tanks and CSOs, because think tanks also have a tendency to do that, based on other capacities, of course, and I think that's where there can also be quite a meaningful cooperation between CSOs and NGOs. But so in that sense, I think civil society organizations also have to ask themselves, what does it mean to be active in G7? I assume that you talked about CSOs in G7 countries. What does it mean to be a CSO, an NGO in a G7 country under the changed conditions as you described them in the paper, and what it means then for campaigns? That's what CSOs usually do, campaigns for requiring credible and effective action.
Thank you so much. Before turning to Jürgen Zattler, thank you so much for being with us. I know that you had a long meeting this morning. It's great that you're here. Before I'm turning to you, because now we've like screwed our order of speakers up anyways, I would like to pick up on what you just said, Imme, because you said that it's about the meaningful engagement of G7 in global affairs, and that the G7 need to remain reliable and also generous international partners. And I think this is actually a perfect line to look at you, Filani, working at the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. What from a, maybe if I can ask like that, from a perspective of Global South, what is it actually that makes the G7 reliable partners for development cooperation?
Yeah, thank you, colleagues. I think it's sort of just jumping into the question. I think I'll follow on from what some of the previous remarks have mentioned. I think one thing to pick up is adaptation, and meaning here adapting to a changing international development landscape. I mean, for a considerable amount of time, you know, sort of members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development really constituted the bulk, overwhelming amount in terms of development cooperation, development assistance throughout the world, you know, throughout regions of the Global South. And you know, to a point where at some stage it was even above 80% of global flows essentially emanated from member states of the OECD DEC. Now what we see is the need for members there, so members such as your G7 members, having to adapt to a development landscape that is not necessarily you know, dominated by members of the G7, but also one which has a different array of mechanisms for international cooperation. So, you know, standard practices of official development assistance, how it is defined, what projects are actually supported. We are seeing different forms of cooperation that have emerged. An example in Africa, I mean, we see increasing amount of countries, external countries, who are having different formats of summit diplomacy with African counterparts. So yes, the EU-Africa summit was mentioned, but you know, I think it was around 2000 when the EU summit first met. That was exactly the year that you also had the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation meeting for the first time. You had your India-Africa Forum summits. You've had a growing engagement from the likes of Turkey, your Gulf states, but also, you know, countries like South Korea, Japan, all of these countries with an increasing interest, not only in Africa, but also in other countries of the Global South. Now that tells us of an international development landscape that is changing. And I think, you know, what Imme said is very important because the question of partnerships means that you're not talking about sort of lamenting that the influence of G7 countries is not as it was. In fact, the attitude should be that we have more stakeholders now to actually fulfill the obligations, to actually ensure that, you know, the global commons, for instance, that more people are, more state actors and non-state actors are contributing towards that. It's quite clear that even if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and now we're obviously in that decade of action, it is quite clear that G7 members alone cannot fulfill the demands that are there. Now, it means that G7 countries have to be looking at the Global South for partnerships. Partnerships not only in the form of a donor-recipient type of a relationship, but partnerships also within the global south of countries that have increasingly made a transition from being primarily recipients of development cooperation to actively being partners in the international development landscape. Now, this could form different forms of partnerships, whether we're talking about triangular cooperation, which was mentioned at the BAPA plus 40. So we need to look at what potential avenues could be done there. But I think what is important from the G7 is to present itself, and for individual countries of the G7 to present themselves as partners with the global south, rather than coming across as lamenting an era where they were the drivers of international development cooperation. And that is a very important mindset shift that is needed. I'll give you an example. I mean, the US has adopted various measures which are sort of aimed or empower the Secretary of State to actually sort of oppose various initiatives that are led by China in Africa. Now, I can understand it from a US perspective, if that's how the US views China, if it views it as in competition and so forth. But you know, the US needs to understand how that comes across to African stakeholders. To African stakeholders, it doesn't come across as the US presenting itself as a partner for development. In fact, it comes across as the US looking at Africa only because China is increasing its engagement within the continent. And therefore, the perception is that Africa is not really important for the US. And this is something that needs to be taken on board also by other members within the G7. Because I think the G7 countries still have a lot to contribute when it comes to countries in the global south. And within that, it is about the way that they support countries in the south. Lastly, I think members of the G7, when it comes to ramping up investments, they need to look at the experience of the pandemic, in a sense that many countries in the south were in the periphery waiting for access to vaccines, PPEs, and others. And they need to ask themselves, how can they work with countries in the south to actually build resilient regional value chains within the global south? And I think there lies a lot of opportunity for investment, including when it comes to Africa, realizing the African Continental Free Trade Area, investing in the soft infrastructure, but also in the hard infrastructure that is needed to actually drive such initiatives forward. But a shift in the mindset, I think, is very, very important and will enable true partnerships to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Filani. And with that, I'd like to go to Jürgen Zattler. Welcome again. It's great that you're here, because this is for us the forum where our Think7 co-chairs can present their policy recommendations and also discuss them with government representatives, as you are as Director General at the German Ministry for Development Cooperation. And maybe I will just, because I know that you joined our session a bit late, so I will just quickly recap what Sébastien had presented. So in their issue paper, they're asking basically for a refreshed G7 approach to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which is two-pronged. First, not only but also the financial support for the Sustainable Development Goals, but also by leading by example. And another important point, as what I find important is what you said, is that countries that are recipients of development cooperation need to have ownership in the programs and in the discussions that we have. And now also with what Filani said, that that the G7 need to present themselves as true partners for the global South and development cooperation. I would like to ask you, first of all, what's your take on what has been presented by the task force co-chairs? And also we know that you had the development ministers meeting only last week. So what are the successes that you can report on, and how well are the things that you put down in the communique aligned with what our task force co-chairs are demanding or advising the G7 to do?
Yes, thanks a lot, and apologies for not being with you earlier. I was in the waiting room and waiting. I could hear most of what you have said, but thanks for the recap again. Perhaps a few remarks in responding. First, of course, the weight of the G7 has somewhat decreased. But the general picture, you know, that the weight of other countries, on contrary, has increased so much. I think it's a little bit too rough. Of course, the weight of China has increased, but what we can see, and that's part of the problem, is that the economic weight of many middle-income countries has decreased in the last years. This is a reversal to what we have seen before. This is the main issue, and which should also concern us, that there are economic problems and other problems by major G20 countries beyond the G7. Anyway, it's true that the G7 has to work in partnership. And perhaps we haven't done it always in a perfect way, but I think that's the understanding, that we have to work in partnership with others, with African countries and others. I will come back to that point. And then with regard to the issue, need for financial support, and leading by example. Yeah, that's also our understanding. I mean, you know that the G7 is not a pledging round. That's very explicit, but this doesn't mean that the G7 doesn't have awareness that there need to be transfers, financial transfers to the global South. And what we can see at the moment with the global debt crisis is the opposite, that these countries are serving their debts, and the net flows are, for some countries, negative. And overall, they are not very positive. So this is linked to the debt problem, which you should really have a close look at as well. And recipients need to have ownership. That's something very, very important. There, I would like to point to some issues the German presidency has launched, which are very, very related to that point. In particular, the so-called JETPs, the joint climate partnerships with selected countries. We can call them climate champions. So developing countries who want to go that way of decarbonizing their economies. There we already have a close partnership, as you know, with South Africa. And now we did the first step to do the same with another couple of countries. That's a partnership approach. It means that there must be contributions by both sides, and the partners have to buy in fully into it. It also comes with obligations. Partnership is not that the one is engaged and the other not. The partners in the South have to take on commitments, for example, reforming their policy frameworks, get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. These are the kind of things. But these partners seem to be ready to do it, and therefore we pursue that approach. And we also have launched the Global Alliance for Food Security. And I don't have to explain why this is important, but this is another another initiative where we try to bring together all forces, the G7, liaising with the G20, the multilateral institutions and our partners in the South. This is this kind of partnership approach. There is another interesting initiative. Our minister, as you know, is committed to a feminist development policy. She has brought into the G7 this concept, and it has been adopted as a guiding principle for all the G7. It's in the document. It's for the first time. This means, for example, that we have to look at things which are very important for women, like the care economy. And of course, the partners have to buy in. And that's something, I mean, which is not evolving by itself, of course, gender equality. So working in partnership also means that you have to discuss, you have to dialogue, you have to find common ground. Then we have launched the Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment. You might have heard about it. It has a lot to do with mobilizing additional funding for infrastructure investment, and there in particular for climate-related infrastructure, but also health infrastructure. And this is a lot about mobilizing private funds, but not only private funds. And you might have heard, we were not very successful mobilizing private funds in the past. Therefore, we set up a working group, an expert group, and we looked at the few, we have a few kind of new ideas which we would like to further discuss with our G7 partners, the multilaterals, and then try to operationalize it. So perhaps these are a few kind of spotlights on what we have discussed last week. It was only Wednesday, Thursday last week. And of course, in the discussion, if you're interested, I can always complement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would actually have like a follow-up question on that, and I take the liberty to ask it, even though I will have to have Ignacio wait for another 2 minutes, because Mr. Zattler, you already mentioned that for the very first time, feminist development policy was included in the communique of the development ministers. And I have been wondering, how do you think will this alter, how will a feminist development policy alter the way to achieve the sustainable development goals? Will it alter the road to achieving the Agenda 2030?
I think it will, but it will not be easy, because many of those issues are touchy, are very touchy in my society here in Germany, but also in the societies in the South. And so you can ask what it is, feminist development policy. And still there, I mean, we will have an exercise here in the ministry to discuss with experts what exactly we mean by it. But we have already identified the care economy as something we have to look at, because it's very important for women, for jobs, but also for whole societies. It's also to look at issues like the war against Ukraine. And we know that women are affected in another way than men. When they leave their country, often there are risks, sexual abuse, but also when they stay in their country. But they have also huge potential. You know what happened in Germany after the World War II. Women played a key role in the recovery. So they have a huge potential, not only in the social sectors. And these are issues where we would probably give more attention to, because they were often neglected in the past. It's not that these things were not known, but in the daily business, they were neglected in the past. Just to give you 2 examples.
Thank you so much. I think now the microphone is back. Thank you so much, Mr. Zattler. And now I'm turning to you, Ignacio. I know that you've been waiting a long time, and we're actually making a very big move from feminist development policy to looking at trade issues. But I think that, like for the Agenda 2030, all of these issues are somewhat interrelated. And so I would like to ask you, first of all, what role does the 2030 agenda play in current trade discussions, such as reform of the WTO, and vice versa? What role does a rules-based free trade that takes into account fair social, environmental, and human rights standards play for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, thank you very much. And first, sorry that I could not connect in the beginning. I think there was some problem with the connection, so I could only listen to the end of the presentation by Sébastien. But I mean, if you actually look into global trade at this point in time, in the new geopolitical context, the US-China conflict, the war of aggression in Ukraine, the challenges for the resilience of supply chains which have been generated by the pandemic, it is clear that we are facing an extremely challenging time for the trade policy, when there is a very significant risk of fragmentation and of moving away from a rule-based approach to trade to a power-based approach to trade. And that is in a scenario which is not good for the European Union. It's in a scenario which is not good for development. And that's what I think, if you want, the fundamental challenge in terms of a dialogue between the EU, G7, and the Global South, is how we can try to ensure that despite this new geopolitical context, we can actually cooperate to ensure that we have effective
Ignacio, unfortunately, your connection is really bad. Could you
now, in 3 weeks' time, we will actually have a meeting of ministers in Geneva. It will be. Oh, can you hear me without the video?
Perfectly. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, sorry. I think that. Okay, so I will. Okay, I'm not sure exactly at what point in time you lost the connection, but I would now move basically to the question of the challenges ahead of us when we actually have a meeting in 3 weeks' time of trade ministers. The first time that trade ministers are going to meet in the WTO since almost 5 years. A lot has changed since then. There's a new director general in the WTO coming from Africa. There's also clearly an important expectation that the WTO should be able to deliver and to show relevance to global trade challenges. Now, it is going to be difficult, and I certainly would not have wanted to generate expectations, but I would say that potentially there are 4 key elements that we should try to see where we can converge among the members of the WTO. The first one is how to be responsive to the challenges for trade that have been generated by the pandemic. And that includes intellectual property, but it is certainly more than intellectual property. I mean, as you know, the European Union has been very much engaged in discussing with India, South Africa, and the United States to try to find a way forward, to try to find a compromise. And I think this is politically significant because it shows that even on extremely challenging issues, it should be possible to find a dialogue and to find compromises between the perspectives of the G7 countries and the perspectives of the Global South. Second fundamental challenge is food security. We may not be able to agree, all of us, about what is at the origin of the present food security crisis, but it is very clear that it will be important that at this stage, the WTO can give a clear signal about the importance of transparency in agricultural markets, about the importance of avoiding export restrictions, and about the need to provide support to the World Food Programme. And the third big global challenge is, of course, environmental sustainability. And that's why it is so important to really make an effort to conclude the negotiations on fisheries subsidies, which, by the way, is the only time that WTO members have been actually carrying out a negotiation on the basis of a specific mandate coming from the UN, coming from the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, it's going to be challenging, but it will be an extremely important signal if ministers in Geneva in 3 weeks' time can agree to the conclusion of the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Now, assuming that we could actually get some progress on these issues, then the important will be what are the next steps ahead of us. And it's very clear that what will be really critical for cooperation between the G7 countries and the Global South is how to ensure that the WTO is made more responsive towards sustainable development. And responsiveness towards sustainable development to really look into the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: the economic development dimension, the dimension of environmental sustainability, and the dimension of social justice. And the challenge is going to be, can we actually have a discussion on these issues which is forward-looking, which is not just looking back and relitigating the outcome of negotiations 25 years ago, but it is really looking what are the challenges to ensure that those developing countries which are not sufficiently integrated in the global trading system can better benefit from a rule-based global trading system, and how to ensure that the WTO can be adapted and be responsive to have a rule-based for the multilateral trade cooperation. I think that is going to be the fundamental challenge. It is very difficult to get agreements multilaterally. It is very difficult to find compromises among the members of the WTO, but at least from the point of view of the European Union, it's an effort worth making, because at the end of the day, if we were going to have a collapse of rule-based trade, if we were going to return into a pure power dynamic on the global trading scene, this would not be good for the European Union, but it would certainly not be good either for development. And that's why we would really hope that this can be a good basis for discussion and cooperation, despite all the challenges between the G7 countries and the countries in the Global South. So I would leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. And I think I'll turn back to Sébastien before we open up the floor for questions. If you have any questions, either here with us in the room or online in the chat. Sébastien, you wrote in your issue paper that the G7 leaders need out-of-the-box processes to initiate requisite jumps in sustainable development investments and outcomes. Can you specify a bit more what you mean by out-of-the-box processes? Do you have specific processes in mind?
I cannot talk for my 2 other co-authors, so this is going to be a personal answer to this important question. Let me first answer by saying that I think the way to think out of the box is to some extent what I would emphasize is that I have the impression that here in this session on development cooperation, we are all agreeing on the idea that the generous position is the right way forward for Europe. I'm not sure that the other session on international security, the colleagues would have agreed on that. And I think that's something where we need that's why I was using the word self-interest. We need to be very clear about the fact that development cooperation, international partnerships, as Imme was saying, is about accepting that G7 countries have lost power but gained partnerships, and partnerships are a strategic asset in the world of today. And those partnerships, we need to build them up through, I would say, innovative processes. That does not mean abandoning the development cooperation institutions. We need them, but also look at the fact that some of the things that I heard a lot, for instance, Filani was saying, we need to build resilient regional value chains in Africa. This is really meaning that we need to think of an intervention by G7 countries or G7 economic operators in productive investments in sub-Saharan African countries or Northern African countries that is going to build up innovation capacities, industrialization capacities in those countries, and not and really try to depart from a vision where we would extract raw materials. Let me just exemplify the fact that when we look at the green hydrogen strategy of Europe, it's again very much perceived in African countries as a strategy that will bring back African countries into an extractive economy position where the added value and the jobs would be in Europe. So what this is a long answer about the innovative process. What I mean is really, I think there is a discussions that we need to have about how we are going to build new value chains between northern G7 countries and southern countries, where of course everybody wants to get their industrial jobs back. That's what we hear a lot in France, for instance. A lot of the ministers, not the recently appointed, but a lot of the politicians are saying we want to reindustrialize France. And how is that going to be compatible with also helping southern countries industrialize? There is going to be a trade-off there, but I think it's useless to try and think that we will get the same industrial jobs back in France as we had 40 years ago. So we need to think about negotiating the value, the job, and the innovation place in those value chains that we are creating in a way that is not just zero-sum game, but that really where if we sit together around those supply chains, we can understand how to make it good for both ends of the supply chain. That was a long answer, because what I mean is that probably some of the things that I'm discussing here are more on the side of the development cooperation, technical thinking than trade policies. I'm not so much sure that trade policies are actually governing those arrangements in the supply chains. It's a lot about what the industrial players, the financial players are doing in the countries. And so I think this is where we probably need to understand what is the global framework on the trade and investment policies, but also look at the room for maneuver that there is for innovative ways to establish those supply chains that would be really delivering jobs on both ends and innovation on both ends. Let me just finalize by saying there was a very interesting report issued last week by the Stockholm Environment Institute and the CEEW from India in preparation of Stockholm Plus 50, where they really advocate for co-development of technologies rather than innovation transfer. And this is not to say that Ignacio was not right saying that there are lots of issues about IPR, intellectual property rights. But I think there is also an issue about how we really accept that innovation is actually occurring in global South countries. And when we discuss again with French players, with players from, let's say, Mali and Senegal, they tell us it's not so much that we need access to technologies because they will anyway come from China. We want to discuss with you how we innovate in the way we use the technologies. That's just to open up a little bit about what I mean by thinking out of the box.
Thank you so much. And now that you were pointing to China, I would like to ask Filani a question, because in your issue paper it also says, and I think that's somewhat related, that the global infrastructure financing agenda must be understood as the heart of the SDG financing arena. And I saw an article that Filani wrote and published in December 2020, where he writes, in order to contribute more to poverty eradication efforts abroad, Northern donors will have to do a better job at understanding what has worked for Southern powers such as China in the development landscape. And so, Filani, my question would be, what exactly is it that Northern donors have to understand?
So I think in that particular reference, I think it was sort of comparing with some of the processes related with the EU. So we know that with the EU has that sort of 7-year, period when it comes to planning and financing. And I think what has generally worked, let's say, better for China is that, well, they're talking about much shorter sort of 3-year periods, but also with annual sort of deliberations on the priorities that are actually coming out of Africa. So there is a relative flexibility when it comes to actually meeting some of the financing needs. And I'll just give you one example. I mean, sort of 2 years before China published what it called its Africa strategy, 2 years before that, we were meeting with think tanks from China over a concerted period, over about a year. They were visiting various capitals across Africa, speaking with think tanks, speaking with civil society, speaking with members in government, and so forth. Just doing some research in terms of what are some of the African priorities that are coming out. And they were doing that in order to inform their Africa strategy. And I think what we've seen in recent years is African stakeholders playing a much more proactive role when it comes to the China partnership itself. So often when we see the reporting, it's often as though China sort of dictates the agenda and then Africa is a recipient. But I can certainly tell you that there is a lot of proactive engagement by African stakeholders, whether it's in the China-Africa think tanks forum or other platforms relating to China's engagements within Africa. And often because politically China wants to also show that it is has a demand-driven approach, that its lending is in line with African priorities. So there is an incentive for them to also show that. A last point is that China has obviously put a lot of investment in economic infrastructure. That is somewhat plateauing right now, but I think that has been quite an important contribution in order to build up that productive infrastructure on the continent, because debt is important, and one of our speakers mentioned it. But I also think when we dissect the debt and we think whether it's going towards consumption or whether it is actually going towards production, that is quite important in determining whether that is necessarily we should be drawing red flags to that debt, or whether that is actually something that can actually be paid back in future. So I think levels of flexibility, it's quite important. I mean, even China is adapting. So I think it's also important to end it by saying China is also learning from G7 countries. And I would say this, including in how, for instance, China initially used to largely engage with state actors. However, what we have seen in recent years is that even the embassies in Africa have made a very proactive engagement towards think tanks and even civil society organizations to try to broaden their engagement and to gain a bit of legitimacy beyond the state. So I think it's important that G7 countries do not just sort of think that, throw their hands in the air. China is also looking at what has worked for G7 countries and is actually trying to use some of those practices in countries of the global south.
Thank you so much, Philani. To be honest, time flies. I could go on for quite a while. Now I see that there's one question in the audience, and I will take this one. But I have to be very mindful. We have 3 minutes before I'm asking the panelists to wrap up. So if I could kindly ask you to ask a question very shortly, and then Stormy also very shortly, and then we have short answers.
Am I on? Yeah. I'm Treyer from Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh. My question is it's more a question, and I have an observation too. My question is, this task force is called International Cooperation for Common Goods, not public goods. We know in literature the difference between public good and common goods. One is, both are non-excludable, but one is rivalrous, whereas the other is not. The choice of the products are also specific to common goods and public goods. When we discuss common goods, public goods are what we have in mind. I don't want to get into that. So please, why did you choose common goods, not the public goods? And what is the political and economic implication of that particular choice? The second point is basically to Emma Shaw's discussion on role of civil society. I just want to bring to this house that SDGs are obviously holistic and interrelated and not additive. So there are trade-offs, and of course there are also synergies. If you look at the traditional CSOs prior to 2015, you have correctly said, Emma, that the emphasis was more on partnership, transfer of resources, and etc. I think things have changed in the last 7 years. I can tell you that Southern civil societies see goal number 17 along with the jewel in the crown, goal number 16. The issue of rule of law, institutions, capacity, human rights are looked into undeniably in relation with the goal number 17. So partnership without the rule of law as the common goods or public goods, and without the institutional capacity, without that is nowhere in the partnership. So there is a change in the Southern civil society to looking at goal number 16 along with 17. Thank you.
Stormy.
Thank you very much. I'm Stormy Milton. I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Germany, and this was my task force also. So my question, well, what we heard earlier on in one of the discussions was that we often share the same values, but not the same interpretations. I wanted to project this to the question of global common or global public goods. Are we sharing the same perspective on them, or are there differences? And this is particularly a question also to Ignacio with regard to the trade world, if there is a shared interpretation of what the global common goods are and how trade fits into it. Thank you.
Sébastien, do you want to start?
No, I think it's a complicated answer because I was not the one choosing the wording. The task force was designated, so I can make my own interpretation. And I think that could be kind of an answer to you. I'm not sure I can be completely exact in the conceptual meaning of commons, but I think relating also to your question, what I find really useful using global common good is really to think of the global commons that we need to build institutions for. I think what is less visible in the word global public good is that there are institutions to be built in a Nostrum type of vision, that we need social discussions and deliberation and institution building to preserve common pool resources, even if we project that at the global scale. That would be my answer. And I believe that there is a kind of an extension probably in this wording where based on global commons like climate or biodiversity, which I think are rightly phrased as commons in the economic concept, there is an extension of sense as if the whole of the Agenda 2030 was a global commons, that we need to build the global institutions to care for them, to nurture them, and to ensure that we preserve them. But there is a lot of conceptual errors behind that if we expand the meaning beyond what is rightly presented as a commons. But I believe what I retain from that is the idea that we have something to preserve globally, which are our common goods, and the sustainable development would be presented as part of that.
Thank you so much. And we actually have the originator of the task force title with us, Imme.
Well, not me alone, but we discussed it. That was when I was at GIU, and my colleagues are laughing here, smiling broadly in their face. But I thank you for that question, actually, Deb, because we did not say goods. We said good, the common good, and that is a big conceptual difference, as you can imagine. So it's not about tradable goods or a market for that, but it's, and in German we have a specific different word for it, which does not allow for this, for mixing up goods and the good. Yeah, and there is a different word for it also in English. I think it's wheel. It's a very strange word. But the common good refers to what the shared interest in well-being, which in the 21st century is very clear, does not only have a local or a national dimension, but clearly a global one, because it's the global changes which destroy the natural livelihoods or the natural foundations of human civilization. And at the same time, finding ways for engaging together for the global common good is extremely ambitious, because it goes contrary to the legitimacy construction of political decisions at national level. So that's what we wanted to say with that title, and obviously we need to be clearer with that. But I think I found it reflected actually in what you wrote in the paper in terms of defining the role of the G7 now. May I also react to Deb's point on the CSOs change? I actually didn't dare to speak about CSOs in the South. I actually referred to the CSOs in the North, and many of them still have this function actually of channeling funding. And it is difficult to find, I think there is some justification for that. And that's what we also do in the foundation. We support CSOs in partner countries in their activities. But I think it is also important for the international cooperation system to think of more horizontal ways of sharing funds. Actually, it's about sharing funds, public funds, and I, in that sense, I also would like to echo what a speaker said. I think it was Georgios who said, invest in existing mechanisms and do not create new ones all the time. So I think that is an important part of what we have to do when looking into the future of international cooperation.
Thank you so much. And now I'm looking a bit stressed at the time because of my role as conference moderator. I would say we're already 1 minute over time. And that's why when I now hand over to Ignacio, I would like to ask you to keep it really short and also be aware that these will be your famous last words for this session. Before I will make a very quick round of one-sentence answers with the other panelists too.
Okay, so my famous last words in reply to the very good question by Stormy. Now, I think that the fundamental challenge that we have in the global trading system in the WTO is precisely that we don't really have a common view about how the WTO should be responsive to sustainable development. I mean, a few years ago, 2 years ago, actually, we had a discussion in the G20, and we could not even agree that sustainable development was a basic principle of the global trading system. That's what I think is so important, that we can demonstrate that despite this starting point, we can converge on some important responses to global trade challenges, and then to build that from there, to build that confidence by trying to identify, not to reform the WTO just for the sake of reforming the WTO, but to reform it to make it more responsive to the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. Is it going to be easy? No. But if we actually fail, I think we have a real serious risk that we no longer will have a global rule-based trading system, and that we will go in the direction of a highly fragmented global economy.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. Filani, if you were to sit at one table with the G7 leaders, what would be the one thing you would advise them to do in 2 to 3 sentences?
Thank you. I would first advise them just to listen. You know, just to not come with any sort of suggestions or recommendations, but just to listen first. Because I think through that, then I think they can actually formulate policies that are actually aligned to the needs of countries in the global south. So listening, I think, is a skill that sometimes we underestimate.
Thank you so much. I've heard you. Imme, if you were to write 2 sentences in hindsight of this year's G7 presidency, what would you wish to write?
I would wish to write that G7 countries pledged, what else can they do, to substantially contribute to the funding necessary for the SDGs and the climate agenda.
Thank you so much. And now I will first go to Jürgen Zattler before I will give Sébastien the last final word. Mr. Zattler, for what would determine a successful leaders summit for you from the development cooperation perspective?
Yeah, thanks. There are many things. to my point of view, it's important not only to come up with deliverables which sound good, but are something like, we call it in German, Potemkin's, or the French say, Chateau en Espagne. It must be tangible, it must be impactful. And for example, the climate partnerships, the so-called JETPs, can make a huge difference. They also cost a lot. They cost a lot for developed countries, for South Africa, for example, for the next years, 8.5 billion. There are many countries on the doorstep who would like to decarbonize. That's something really, really relevant and impactful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Sébastien, if you were to write one sentence in the leaders' communique, what would it be?
I'm not sure I'm the one to write that, but I would say something around, we recognize that it is in our own self-interest to fight global inequalities. And we commit to be the co-champions of global sustainable development in a shared leadership. I mean, I'm insisting a lot on those wordings in order to prepare for a better second half of the SDG period. That would be the sentence.
Thank you so much. A better second half of the SDG period with more partnerships, more listening to others, and a stronger focus on the environment. I think that's very good, famous last words by the panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone also for your patience that I, as even though I'm the conference moderator, took the liberty to take 5 minutes more. And with that, I would like to close the panel. I thank all the panelists for this great discussion. I could go on for quite a while, but that's it. Thank you so much, and I hope we'll keep discussing afterwards.